Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell, and welcome back to Total Overhaul, the newest series on this channel. It is a l'avant-garde series, and as such, if you're an AoE2 purist, viewer discretion is advised. On last episode, we talked about time frame and why it matters for historical games, especially Age of Empires 2, and on this episode, we will be covering movement, everything to do with unit positioning, line of sight, terrain, and similar. As always, if you like the content, please do the YouTube stuff of subscribe and Discord and I guess Ko-Fi if you have a couple of bucks. But more importantly, there is something else I would really love for you to consider taking a look at. Namely, yes, indeed, Enclave, my own tabletop role-playing game. We got a Kickstarter coming in September, so if you have any interest in TTRPGs, please do hit the notify me on launch button of my campaign, linked in the description down below. Let us move on to the introduction. If you are new to this Total Overhaul series, here is what it's about. It is a hypothetical Total Overhaul mod of Age of Empires 2. I'll be tackling different design elements each video. Everything covered will be technically implementable in the current game via Genie Editor, but will be very different from the current sensibilities of AoE2, and each vid will end, or section of a vid, will end with a wishful thinking section outlining stuff that isn't currently feasible but I would love to see. I will note, this particular video has a lot of wishful thinking in it. Will this mod ever get made? We will see. But more importantly, this series is a framing device for discussing the RTS genre. These are not changes that I would necessarily want mandated upon AoE2, besides maybe as an alternate game mode. But I can't deny that AoE2 is moving in a direction I don't love, and maybe you feel the same. As such, this series will be theory crafting my ideal historical RTS through the lens of a hypothetical AoE2 mod for context. I think that RTSs are in general decline due to creative stagnation and dogmatic adherence to a rigid arcade-style framework. This is my attempt to shake things up and innovate. Please do comment your thoughts. A lot of these videos will be weird and unprecedented, so I'd really appreciate your input on them. Might not have time to reply, but I'll be reading the comments and taking notes, and many episodes, including this one, will also include a poll so you can help me resolve uncertainties and contribute your thoughts. If you want to vote in the poll, take a look down below after you've watched the video. And with that, let's briefly go over last episode. Last time, we covered, first of all, the general goals of this series, why I started it, what I'm hoping to do with it, and, of course, historical authenticity being a big focus for my channel. Reducing micro was something I want this series and this hypothetical, ideal historical RTS to achieve. And adding complexity is my final major goal. I dream of an unsolvable game, or as close to unsolvable as possible. But more than general goals, we discussed time frame. I complained about the current one not really making sense, and I proposed 6 alternatives, each spanning between 150 and 300 years. You guys got to vote on which time frame we'll be discussing in this series, though, of course, a potential hypothetical dream world historical RTS could cover many of these time frames, but we'll be starting with one, and that winner is From the Ashes, which again spanned from about 600 to, sorry, that was gross. From the Ashes, which spanned roughly 600 to 850-ish AD. I can't remember my own time frames. It was something like that. And another poll will be coming in this video. Though, fair warning, again, this particular episode will be like 75% wishful thinking. A lot of this stuff isn't implementable, but it's still important to talk about. And I should note that everything I'm proposing in this video has been done by an RTS at some point, with like maybe 1 or 2 exceptions. Now, let us proceed to the main topic of today's video, movement, and it's generally how units reposition and why it matters. So let's begin by talking about the achievable stuff, which fortunately there's a decent amount of. I really like the AoE2 movement engine. I don't think there's a single other RTS that feels as satisfying to control as Age of Empires 2. And I credit that in large part to the game's timelessness. Special shout out, by the way, to units automatically grouping into formation to march. Oh, why doesn't every RTS do that? It's so awesome. Now that said, despite me loving the base movement engine, I want to see more invisible complexity. stuff kind of happening behind the scenes that a new player probably wouldn't notice or care about and would still be able to fall in love with the engine without memorizing, but more experienced players can kind of dive into and explore. A lot of this is, I think, common sense, and a chunk of it are things that I'm hoping will improve balance of the game and balanceability of the game without taking away from the movement engine, or maybe even adding more kind of like weight and gravitas to it. Now, first change. Infantry and cavalry charge into battle. What does that mean? You take the current samurai effect and you make it applicable to all infantry and cav. It would be more dramatic for cavalry, but have maybe a lower cooldown for infantry. This, I think, is essential. It's something I would love to see. It's historical, it's interesting, it makes like combat more dynamic, it makes a lot more give and take, and I think it would be just generally super duper cool. You'd of course not want to like have the cooldowns be like wildly different between different types of infantry and different types of cavalry. They should be in the same general family so that you can get a feel for when your charges are coming off of cooldown, even if you're not like meticulously keeping track, and I don't want to have bars over everyone. You could also argue to reduce all base movement speeds in the game to like partially compensate for this. I wouldn't want the game to become too blazingly fast, because that is again heavily inclined towards micro, and I think that maybe toning down speed a little bit and compensating with infantry and cavalry charging when they're attacking will keep the fun, satisfying part and maybe slightly tone down the micro burden. Another achievable thing, melee attacks briefly slow targets univirally. Incorrect spelling, Robbie. I would see like maybe 20% for infantry, 10% for cavalry, with some exceptions. Maybe even not for cavalry. Maybe this is just an infantry thing. I'm not sure. This is there to help represent and penalize routing, the ender of all battles, historically speaking, or the vast majority of them. And it makes battlefields feel more consequential. Retreating is very free in Age of Empires right now. There's a lot of dancing around, and commitment to a battle doesn't really mean that much. I think it would be much more interesting, much more tactical, much more exciting, and frankly take a lot less micro if committing to a battle meant more and retreating was less free. Plus, I think there's a big intuitive element to this change, though I will say this is one of those changes that could really chug the engine, and I understand is possible to implement, but would be a pain in the ass to implement. Same with the samurai effect thing on all infantry and cavalry. Doable, but possibly a pain in the ass, and could screw with the engine a bit. Next, turn rate on siege and ships. Right now, siege and ships is like, and like go about face instantaneously. I think that is dumb. This is not only actually doable and is a thing currently in the game. Trebuchets do. Hey, what's that elephant doing there? Whatever, get out of here. Not only is this actually doable, and you can see it on things like trebuchets, but it would help siege and ships feel more weighty and unwieldy and powerful, and help them feel more different from other units, which, God, they desperately need. More on siege and ships in future episodes. Now, in terms of movement, that stuff that is borderline, like maybe technically doable, but would be like a true pain in the ass or have dire consequences. Let's talk about a small turn rate on all units. Now, I should note, games like Warcraft do have turn rate on all units, but it's way too long. Like, they have this like tank girls where they're like, and it just makes it like super duper slow. I don't want that. I would want a tiny, like a beat turn rate on foot soldiers, practically unnoticeable, but on cavalry have it be a little higher. Horses can't turn on a dime, and I would want cavalry to have to commit a little more in their charging, similar to why I'm giving them the charge bonus. This is something I do feel strongly about, but I'd want it to be really subtle. The sort of thing that only mattered in very split-second, high micro situations. You could say, well, this increases micro burden because you have to be paying attention. Not really. It means that you can't be dancing back and forth quite as much. It disincentivizes that, and it makes it so that even if you don't have huge APM, you do still need to have some timing to figure out when to get your units and how they're going to be moving and directing. I'd also love if cavalry did like a little loop rather than a tank turn. Empire Earth 1 does this, by the way, but that's pretty much impossible in AoE2. I embrace that. But, again, put that in wishful thinking. Now, the thing that puts this in borderline is that having a little turn rate on all units could really chug the game, so you'd have to approach this carefully. At the end of the day, I think siege and ships are the most important ones to have this on. Another one, longer wind-up on most ranged attacks. The archers in AoE2 are the fastest shooters I've ever seen in my life. Stutter stepping, more broadly, is so annoying. I hate it. It's a wild increase to micro burden. It's obnoxious as hell to deal with, and it makes archers wildly broken unless you make other things broken to compensate. Stutter stepping should not be a universal tactic for all ranged units. It maybe makes sense for some ranged units, and for those, maybe they can have a unique short windup on ranged decks, but I would much prefer if all archers had at least a cavalry archer style one, where they have to really go through it in order to shoot the damn thing, and they can't just like stop on a dime, shoot, and then run. I think that's obnoxious. Now, unfortunately, adding increased windup on attacks can really mess with animation frames, so this would be very jank to implement. Probably could not do it now, but it is a possibility, especially if they fix that jank. Another thing, collision. I hate unit stacking. Oh, don't get me started on like sticking 20 archers together and clumping them on one block in like a forest, and then you can't get to them. Does anyone find that fun? Maybe I'm weird. Maybe I'm weird, but I really sincerely believe that like unit stacking is a problem, and unit collision size should be increased to compensate. Units should take up more space. Not a ton, by any means. They shouldn't like not be able to cross by each other, but more than they do now. Now, of course, this would again probably screw with the current engine, which is why it's in Borderline, but it's something in a hypothetical RTS made from scratch I would really want to see something done about, because stacking does not make a happy Rob. Again, maybe there'll be certain units that it could make sense for. Hey, get the hell out of here. Jesus Christ. Anyways, now that we have discussed the Borderline stuff, I say it's time to proceed to wishful thinking. We've already covered some wishful thinking already in this section, but there's more, one of them being acceleration. Namely, units take a brief moment to go from standstill to full speed. This should be quick and unnoticeable, except for, again, something like cavalry. I would want Cav to feel more different from foot units, but even foot units, it makes sense that they take like a little hop, skip, and a jump before they go like charging forwards at full speed. I wouldn't want this to be sluggish and slow. I want it to be crisp and barely noticeable, but something that if you get really good at the game, you'll start to get like a feel for, and I think that's awesome. You could even maybe justify putting top speeds higher to compensate for acceleration being in the game. Depends on how it felt in practice. Another wishful thinking thing, longer ranged reload time while moving. Again, making starter stepping harder. This means if you shoot and you immediately start to run, your archer does not have time to knock another arrow, and therefore their reload timer is like 50% longer or something like that. I realize I didn't complete my sentence in this bullet point. It requires commitment for archers. And I think that's wildly more interesting and more historically accurate. Of course, some like units like maybe skirmishing archers might not be very affected by this. That's totally fine. This could be a variable that could be tweaked. And some units like siege, crossbows, should be highly affected by this, where maybe their reload timers are like tripled while they're moving or something like that. So it technically is able to reload, it's just wildly slow. Another thing, this is getting into quite l'avant-garde territory, endurance penalties. If a unit is moving or fighting for a long time non-stop, they will very slowly lose HP, down to like 33%. And also, all units at or below 33% HP could have stat penalties, including speed, especially speed, representing them getting tired. God, this was so important historically, and isn't that hard to represent? Now, to compensate, because this is pretty punishing, all units would have a baseline HP regen when still for prolonged periods in time, gradually increasing the longer you stay put. So if they're still for like 30 seconds, they'll get a little trickle. And if they stay still for like 2 minutes, they'll regenerate pretty quickly, and I think that's very fair. Resting your army was just wildly essential. Also, healing in general in my ideal mod slash RTS game would be like generally much more accessible than it is now. So you would have many ways to heal your soldiers, even on top of their like this baseline HP regen when still. I just don't like how we are constantly incentivized to have units be doing stuff, constantly doing stuff. Again, it's a lot of micro burden. Give people an incentive to take it slow, and give people soft penalty for constantly moving their soldiers. The poor bastards get tired. Like I said, choosing when to rest was so important in medieval warfare, and this once again strikes towards my goal for this series of reducing micro burden. More wishful thinking that attacking while moving, especially for cavalry archers. It would be even super cool if you could make this directional, namely like a thrown weapon could be fired while moving when you're charging a target as part of like your charge bonus, you know, but you couldn't be like running away and like hawking axes over your shoulder. Whereas for something like a cavalry archer, it makes sense that you should be able to shoot forwards, shoot backwards. Yeah, so in summary, directional. I think that would be sick. But just attacking while moving needs to happen. Not for all units, God, not for all units, but for certain ones, needs to be an option. And it should have some downsides, like maybe without certain technologies or something, shooting while moving could have worse accuracy, longer reload, that sort of thing. Another thing about wishful thinking, flanking and directional damage. Being attacked from the front should do less damage, especially if you have a shield. Being attacked from behind should do more damage, period. And maybe could convey a bigger melee speed penalty too, so that if you're like fleeing and someone's whacking you from behind, you're just like slogged down. Now, remember, routing was how most soldiers died. And so something like flanking, on top of the speed penalty I described earlier, are a great way to represent that and help, again, battles feel more consequential and retreating less free. And will also make outmaneuvering a vastly bigger deal, so that you can actually win a battle with a smaller force, even like a smaller and weaker force, if you just position them well, which I think is wildly important. And one more thing for you. Zone of control, namely a collision box that is bigger for enemies than for allies. This would make body blocking easier, and I think it's important to be able to control space with units. Hence why I think a zone of control of some kind could be a cool idea, so that enemies can't just like run past your guys, which happens like pretty often in game right now, and I don't think should. This is not something I feel like super strongly about, hence why it's at the end of this section. And even if it was implemented, it would be, again, quite subtle indeed. And of course, couldn't be done right now because, God, it would absolutely screw with so many elements of the game. I'm not married to it. I'd need to see it in practice before I commit it. Oh, hello there, elephant. Now, what's this elephant in the room been doing here for? Zone of control, the slowing attack thing, a lot of these mechanics I'm proposing would absolutely murder pathing. And I understand that, hence the elephant in the room. That's the gag, guys, I'm explaining the joke. Pathfinding. It's the bane of all RTSs. There are so few RTSs that have like truly satisfactory pathfinding. All of them have some sort of problem with it. And Age of Empires, despite it having, honestly, I think really good pathfinding, we players still know it has vast limitations. And even though we love things like marching informations, there's still going to be times when units take like mind-bogglingly stupid paths to where you want them to go. And I understand that pathfinding is a really important consideration in RTS design in general. I don't have like a good answer for you guys as to how all of my proposed changes would be feasible within a pathfinding framework. I don't know. And so take all of what I'm saying in this and other sections in this video, assuming it'd work with pathfinding in AoE2 or another hypothetical RTS. I'm sure there's a way to make it work, but probably not in Age of Empires. It would probably have to be a ground-up RTS that was able to support all this weirdness within its pathfinding engine, and even then I'm sure it would have a litany of problems. So yes, elephant in the room, sorted. Let's move on to the next subsection of this video, line of sight. Why do I have this grouped in with movement? Well, as you see, it's to do with unit positioning, and I would argue that line of sight is the most underrated mechanic in all of RTS. Let's first talk about why line of sight matters so much, because I probably emphasize it more than you're used to seeing. Line of sight adds information asymmetry to a game, which I love. Information asymmetry brings strategic dimensions of tricking and reading your opponent. It's one of the things I love most in games, why I'm a huge poker fan, for example. And RTSs could use more of it. I'd say substantially more. Remember the famous quote, all warfare is based in deception. You've heard it before. It's there for a reason. Now currently, Age of Empires 2 line of sight is wildly simplistic. Units just see everything in a big ring around them, or are like wildly nearsighted to the point of blindness. And yeah, I know it's like meant to be an evocative mechanic rather than a literal one, but we can evoke it better in a way that remains intuitive while being more cool and engaging and giving us options for more interesting mechanics. But Robbie, you say, scouting is already important. Of course line of sight matters. Yes, of course, but information asymmetry should always be relevant at all phases of the game. And information should do more to decide engagements and allow someone on the back foot to turn a fight around in a more dramatic and profound manner. I think that scouting needs to be more important, and line of sight and information asymmetry in general should be a much bigger part of Age of Empires 2. Now, what is achievable with line of sight changes? First of all, I would bump up some of the crappier line of sights in the game and tone down some of the massive ones, especially in later ages. Line of sight shouldn't scale as hard. Should be a bit higher than it is right now, but overall there should be fewer extremes. I should note that this would be a stopgap fix. I don't love it, but without more interesting and complex line of sight mechanics available, I think it's the best option we have. Another major change I would make is ranged units would require spotters. Namely, ranged units should have higher range than they do line of sight in many, though not all, cases. This is, again, suboptimal. I would love if line of sight was able to fulfill all of this, but as you will see in my later episode on ranged units, I think ranged units should have much higher range than they do now. And it is technically doable. You can see that in examples like the 256 times tech mod for evidence. Now, again, archers right now are stupid for many reasons, and I do have many other big changes for them, namely like big buffs to range, like I said, and others besides. Don't worry, I know that sounds cracked, and on paper it is, but I have ideas to make it not insane, and to make archers a lot more fair while still being more believable. Now, that's just the achievable stuff for line of sight. Let's move straight to the wishful thinking. There ain't no borderline here. Frankly, most of this section is wishful thinking. First of all, directional line of sight. Units should see very far in front of them, not so much their sides, and almost nothing behind them. I think that makes a boatload of sense. You have like a cone of vision. Additionally, terrain, elevation, for certain buildings, and maybe even large massive units should obstruct vision. This wouldn't necessarily be all or nothing. Like a loose set of straggler trees might only reduce line of sight by like 25% after a certain point, whereas a dense forest could block it entirely. And this would get fiddly, don't get me wrong, this could be wildly fiddly, but I think if you play around with it enough, you can hit a really intuitive dynamic that a new player can look at and be like, oh yeah, I can see why my unit can see there and can't see here. And then, of course, elevated units, like units on elevation, or tall buildings could see over some vision blockers. So it will make elevation more relevant, it will make towers more relevant in different ways. There's a lot of cool things that this could do. And again, vastly increases tactical possibilities, makes terrain way more important, makes walls more formidable because you can't see past them. There's so many benefits that this has. And for games that do stuff like this, StarCraft, vision blockers, I think are essential. Now, again, this could mess with pathfinding, and especially ranged attacks. For the latter, I do have an idea of how to ameliorate that problem, but I want to save that for the ranged episode where I talk about archers. But yes, again, like with everything we discussed, I know this could screw with pathfinding. I don't have a great answer for you. More wishful thinking. Surprise. Namely, if a unit is unnoticed until it is close to an enemy, it will surprise that enemy, briefly dealing bonus damage to it and causing that enemy to have much worse rate of fire. Yes, this is tricky to reconcile with groups. Ideally, this would only trigger if you aren't too outnumbered, but should still apply if a small force surprises a big one. So I'm not sure how to reconcile the group side of things, but I love the idea behind surprise. It's very important in military history. It's very important in combat and survival in general. And on top of that, it would stack with the flanking bonus mentioned earlier, meaning that a surprise attack from behind would be devastating. It means that armies should always be watching their backs, and if an enemy is being incautious, you can jump on them and overwhelm them with a vastly inferior force. It also means stealth is way more important, and being aware of where your enemy can see. This mechanic is another kind of common sense realism thing, and I think it would be super cool, but it would be really hard to implement satisfactorily. It would take a lot of fiddling, a lot of tweaking. I still want it. Desperately want this to work. And I will say this is probably the most ambitious mechanic in this entire video. Add a guess from me. Would love to hear what you guys think. Make sure you fill out the poll after you watch the video if you want to give me some feedback on this episode and influence future ones. More on that in a moment. But before that, the final section of this episode, terrain. Let's make terrain a little more interesting, shall we? Because right now, God, it's boring. It's just reflavored layers of flat. So why does terrain matter? Terrain obviously adds great strategic depth. A good engagement suddenly requires a lot more thinking than just straight up micro, and it's another way to reward tactics over trigger skill and APM. We already have this to some degree in AoE2. Elevation, cliffs, and trees all have strategic impact. I just want more. Now, how can we avoid this being random, though? Because, of course, losing to an unfavorable map generation is already tilting enough, and if terrain is super impactful, that'll just get worse, right? Wrong. I have an idea for this, but I'd prefer to save it for a later video on map design and map generation. Just know, I have an idea for this. Don't you worry. And what about water? Oh god, I'm going to save that one for a future video as well. It's a big topic, and I want to keep these episodes, like, shortish. Take a look at the poll below to vote on that plus other topics. You'll help influence what comes after episode 3, because episode 3 is locked in. Episode 4, I want to hear your opinions on. Now, wishful thinking. Hello, wishful thinking. Good to see you again. Seems like I'm seeing your face a lot in this video, for good reason. Elevation. In addition to the line of sight blocking offense as mentioned, maybe even boosting line of sight as well for units high up on it more explicitly, it should also affect movement speed. You should be much slower going up, plus more endurance penalties, like I mentioned earlier, and maybe a bit faster coming down. Maybe you could give small boosts or penalties to range even if you really wanted to. It should be much harder to build on slopes as well. Maybe take more time, structures take more damage, something like that. And a side note, cliffs are jank as hell. Right now they're like objects that you like put down and they're clunky and don't really work. And if you put a cliff on elevation, it gets like awkwardly separated, hence that weird gap between them. I think they should be painted on elevation instead of being flat objects, so they require elevation to be there. I also kind of like the idea of cliffs being very slowly climbable by foot units, but doing so is like super exhausting and super vulnerable, but we can go into that in the future. Now, another piece of wishful thinking. I would love for terrain to be classified and grouped by biome, which means that all terrain would have equivalents in each different biome. So, for example, you'd have like mountain forest options, you'd have marsh forest options. You could still mix and match them however you want. But what this does is it would let us keep effects consistent and universalizable, plus it will let mappers like repaint their maps. Now, more wishful thinking. Difficult terrain. Mud, river fords, rocky screes, loose sand, and similar would all be classified as difficult terrain. Visibly different. You could just look at it and tell, oh yeah, that's difficult terrain, all right. And it would inflict penalties similar to elevation, including to buildings. Harder to build on, harder to cross, more endurance penalties, and maybe even possibly slowly damage over time to units who are inside it for too long, to represent, you know, like disease or people slipping on rocks and breaking ankles and that sort of thing. You could have multiple levels of difficult terrain, each visually distinct to represent just how treacherous the terrain was, with some being like, not so bad, you can pretty much ignore it, and some being crippling. I think that could be very cool too. You could have a lot of different possible variations with like little intuitive differences. I think that would be sick. And there's so many options that you could go with just within this system. So long as, again, it was visually obvious what it should do, so that a player didn't have to like know the intricacies of the rule to be able to interact with it, which I think is really important to do. I'd even love if masses of bodies could count as increasingly difficult terrain. So if there's a huge battle, it just gets harder to move. You might say, that's kind of grisly and sounds unrealistic. Oh ho ho, but it is not. There are many reports of famous medieval battlefields, Agincourt, for example, where bodies became a massive problem for one or both armies and made it harder for everyone to move. Oh, and funnily enough, this is actually technically doable in the game right now, but would be like wildly tedious to set up. Next, undergrowth, another classification of terrain. Different from forest in that it's difficult terrain, but units can pass through it, and units inside gain stealth until enemies are too close, depending on their size, of course. Like a battering ram isn't really going to get much. Stealth mechanics are 100% something I want to see more of, both for purposes of surprise, tactical depth, and also because they're just cool. Including universal applications like this. Stealth shouldn't be just gated to certain units. It should be something that anyone can take advantage of if you play cleverly, depending on map generation, and historically speaking, undergrowth is a great place to hide and stage an ambush. Also, undergrowth would have to be cleared in order to be built on, maybe giving you some resources in the process. And if not completely removed, it would very slowly grow back. More wishful thinking. Forests. This one is kind of the crown jewel of the terrain section, and there's a lot to get into, so let's begin. For example, cut for wood like now, but forests should also serve as vision blockers, and you should be able to move through them. For Christ's sake. Yeah, speed penalties, sure, and maybe certain units like big engines and things, and maybe cavalry to some degree could not. Forest should offer stealth as well as protection from projectiles. And all this could scale in the forest density, which would be visually apparent, and come in many levels, like with difficult terrain, like I mentioned earlier. Like a straggly thicket would be like almost negligible, whereas an impassable deep forest would be something that even a foot unit couldn't move through, and you'd have to slowly cut. Density level could have different resource amounts, could be harder or easier to harvest from. Lots of cool options you have there. And individual trees would no longer be discrete objects like they are now. They wouldn't have their own hitbox, so to speak. But you could still have individually placeable, like standing trees that were individual objects and couldn't be passed through. Felled trees would also not block movement, but should count as highly difficult terrain. I think that's very important. And like undergrowth, if not completely clear-cut, a forest should slowly grow back. So yeah, lots to do with forests. There's so many ways that they can be improved upon while still keeping the general RTS feel we know and love them for. But there's one other thing I want to talk to you about with terrain today, which is the weirdest one. Fertile ground. So it'd be a flat terrain type, visually distinct. It would be like cool and colorful and flowery or whatever, and would have no substantial unit penalties. Farms and crop type buildings planted on fertile ground would be way easier to make and have much better resource gains, including like harvesting rates. Whereas farms made on normal ground would be like notably worse, but you can still work them. Many terrain types should never be able to have farms planted on them, whereas fertile ground is where you want to put your farms. And most games could start with the player's towns surrounded by like a little cluster of fertile ground to help early farm production, and others would appear around the map kind of clustered like resource nodes. I could see a mechanic wherein fertile ground could become like normal through over farming, so you lose the fertile bonus, or like normal ground could become fertile through some sort of mechanic, I'm not sure. But I'd have to see how relevant and like commonly done that was historically in the Middle Ages, especially on the tight time frames we're considering for this series. Why am I talking about fertile ground? This seems so silly. Well, control of productive farmland was wildly important all around the world for multiple millennia. Wars were fought over it, like countries were built upon it. This was just, you cannot compare how important fertile productive farmland was. And so I think controlling fertile ground should be like one of the major strategic objectives in game, because it will just allow you to amp your food production to ridiculous levels. And for people who can't get the fertile ground, you would be able to either contend yourself with the kind of meh farmland you have, or shift your economy to one less focused on crops, like pasturing, which would be less dependent on fertile ground but have other downsides. Whew. And with all that, we come to the end of episode 2, Movement, Elevation, Line of Sight, Terrain. And join me next time for a discussion on aging up, win conditions, progression more broadly, as well as something very, very special that I don't think I have seen an RTS ever do before, though I've definitely seen 4X games do it. But before that comes out, I would love to hear your thoughts. How are you guys enjoying this series? The mechanics I've discussed in this, what you want to see me discuss in future videos. Make sure to respond to the poll. And also, please check out my game Enclave on Kickstarter. Again, we're in the pre-launch stage. Just hit notify me on launch if you have any interest in TTRPGs. I would be tremendously grateful. That is the best possible way that you can contribute to me and this channel going forwards. I very much hope that you have enjoyed this episode. And until we meet again for episode 3, my name is Robbie Howell. And ciao for now.